So let's now get some more insight into the 2024 budget proposal by the President today. And we're now being joined by the lead director of Center for Social Justice, Mr. Eze Onyekpere. Thank you for joining us on the News at 10.
My pleasure.
All right, so first, let me ask you for your impression of the budget proposal that was done today by the President in terms of its size and components. What's your reaction?
I'm not usually excited by the figures that are put out on the first day of the budget because some of the figures may not be realistic. It's only when you get into the implementation stage and you have the full details that you can now make the correct call. First of all, we are looking at a revenue profile of about 18 trillion before we start talking of funding the deficit. And from previous experience over the years, we've hardly made up to 10 trillion as actual revenue. So it will be more or less some form of magic or miracle of how that 18 trillion is going to come. And then we have a 45% of the expected revenue going to be used to pay back debts. And of course, if you don't get that 18 trillion, the percentage of debt service to actual revenue, of course, will also keep increasing. So overall, it's just the usual routine, but the details is what matters in terms of whether they're realistic. For instance, if you look at the budget breakdown done by the Honorable Minister, you find a troubling situation where for 2023, despite the figures of about 23 trillion, only 25% capital expenditure has been released. And so doing that and getting into the last quarter, at most for 2023, we may not get up to or more than 35 to 40% capital expenditure release. But at the beginning of the year, we were celebrating, oh, we have such a huge budget. So the implementation and of course how realistic the figures are is what will determine the way forward.
All right, so the President has identified three main areas of priority in the budget for 2024. We're talking about security, job creation, and of course poverty reduction. How do you expect these areas to impact on the overall economy?
Well, if insecurity can be reduced, farmers going back to the farms and producing, of course, that will touch on food inflation. And of course, it will also improve the ease of doing business in Nigeria, and a lot of other stakeholders will become more productive. And then you talk about poverty reduction. Poverty reduction cannot stand on its own. It's a product of activities and interventions in a lot of sectors. So by the time you talk about interventions in education, health, and then creating more jobs through industrialization, improving the megawatts of electricity coming from the power sector, then you can begin to talk of poverty reduction and creating new jobs. So it's not just something that stands alone. But the fear I have is that the projections for revenue that will be able to help us realize this are overtly ambitious.
The budget assumptions, exchange rate of 750 naira to the US dollar, talking about a production of 1.78 million barrels of crude per day and an oil benchmark of $77.96 per barrel. How feasible are these assumptions, I mean, given what we have seen since the administration came on board?
Well, 1.78 million barrels a day is realistic if government can curb oil theft and, of course, prevent pipeline vandalization. And also, NNPC can begin to up the investments in the sector. If you recall, as at 2015, we are doing about 2.1 million barrels. Indeed, I had expected the current administration to have a target of about 2.5 million barrels to see how we can up the ante. Because once we're able to do that, we have more resources for the three tiers of government to share at the federation account, and we will have more foreign exchange to defend the value of the naira. So even if we cannot do it immediately, I hope that before the end of 2024 and mid-2025, we will be able to move beyond 2 million barrels a day. 750 to the dollar looks realistic if we can continue the course of reforms and make sure we get more foreign exchange to defend the naira. But then what I find a little bit unrealistic is things like maybe inflation rate of 21% or thereabout. I do not see the magic that will be performed between now and next year for us to be able to get that, unless it's just an aspiration for us to work with. But if you look at the way things are going, inflation may also likely increase beyond what we have now.
All right, and finally, the deficit for next year, we understand, is put at 9.18 trillion naira. That's representing 3.88% of the nation's GDP. That's a drop from a deficit of 6.11% in the 2023 budget. Is that something we should be cheered about or cheering ourselves about?
Well, the deficits, the figures you have now is dependent or will be dependent on how much revenue we raise. If we raise as much revenue as we project, then the deficit can stay there. But if the revenue underperforms, what will likely happen is that we are going to borrow more. So like I said, it's a question of whether the revenue we're expecting will come. If it doesn't come, we are likely going to borrow more than the 9 trillion that is projected.
Mr. Onyekpere, the lead director of Center for Social Justice, thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your thoughts on the news at 10.
My pleasure.